that will give us a good indication of how many people are listening and perhaps where you're calling from. Great. It looks like the majority of people are just one person in a room, but we do have a few with more than 2 and a few with more than 8. Here at Cutter at the University of South Florida, we are in a conference room and we have a number of people joining us live as well. So you may or may not hear from them if they have questions. And which department do you work with within your agency? Okay, great. It looks like the majority of folks joining us today are from the administrative sector. And then my last question, could you please rank your familiarity with the Sunshine Laws? Great. It looks like we have a number of folks who are kind of all over the board, but the majority are somewhat familiar with the Sunshine Laws, and that will certainly help Alexis do her presentation today. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Alexis, who is the Deputy General Counsel for the Office of the Attorney General, Bill McCollum. She specializes in sunshine and public laws, helping citizens, government entities, and other media under Florida's century-old open government laws. Alexis grew up in Palm Beach Gardens and holds 3 degrees from the University of Florida. She is also an adjunct professor of communications at Florida State University, where her students are none too pleased with her gator tags as she drives up on campus. And we've had quite a few conversations about that as she's at the USF campus today. So without any further ado, Alexis.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's an interesting new format for me. That's actually my favorite part of my job, actually, going to work with practitioners and talking to them about kind of what fits into your day-to-day life without it being preferably obtrusive. I have been working primarily in the realm of sunshine and public records for Attorney General Bill McCollum for the last 3 years, and have worked on his executive staff since 2007. It's been quite a ride. And one of the projects that was about the spearheading my role has been putting a lot of the petition regarding government entities' rights and responsibilities. And I want to emphasize that we do have rights as well as responsibilities under those public records laws. Public records laws went on the books in 1909. So before women could vote, there was a public records law worked into.
Alexis is just changing her microphone.
Okay, we're MacGyvering this thing together. Now that I'm wearing my pilot microphone, I just want to say, negative Ghost Rider, the pattern is full. The Attorney General's office, in addition to playing a law enforcement role and in being playing a litigation role for public-oriented litigation in Florida, also has a very strong educational role. And a lot of that has to do with dealing with access to government and access to government records. Since 1909, it has been the overarching policy of this state that all records made or received in connection with the transaction of government business are public records, which means that those records are subject to inspection and copying by any person under reasonable circumstances and within a reasonable time. These are not novel concepts. Actually, James Madison in the Federalist Papers wrote about how important it was for a popular government to also be providing popular information so that the citizenry could be informed while they're making their building and adjusting their democratically created government. Where's my arrow? Okay, that's right. Okay. So as part of our sort of educational role, we wanted to put a lot of information about the Sunshine Law on the internet so that it was accessible to you, because there are a lot of widespread urban myths about what the Sunshine Laws really mean, and a lot of them were wildly inaccurate. Your private records are still private. No one has a right to your health care records. HIPAA supersedes the Sunshine Law. No one cares what you had for lunch, and no one has the right to know what kind of birth control you do or do not use. Okay. When we talk about citizens having the right to access their government, we're talking about citizens having the right, if they so choose, to understand the decision-making process that goes into government activity. We're talking about citizens having the right to know how their tax dollars are being spent and for what purpose, and if they so choose, to understand the whole decision-making process that goes from, the idea to becoming the bill, to becoming the law, to becoming the really cool urban planning building right smack in the middle of USF's campus. Let's see. We created this website as a reference source for when you have more generalized questions. The Attorney General's office also produces legal opinions on a regular basis on a wide range of topics related to Florida law. If you work for a government entity and have a question regarding Florida law, your in-house counsel can submit a request for a legal opinion to the Attorney General's office. You can access the format for that on myfloridalegal.com. Or if your records, if your question is relating specifically to public records, we would encourage you to come to myflsunshine.com for records relating specifically to public records issues. And you can see our press releases and our most recent Attorney General opinions related to the subject matter. When we talk about public records, we do mean email. Your email that is made or received in connection with the transaction of your work doing state business is public record. It is subject to inspection and copying. This means that we must all be very mindful of how we use our email accounts and how we discuss our public business. Now, this also means that if you are transacting state business on your personal email account, that you need to be archiving and maintaining that record as a public record. I understand that you cannot control what you receive, especially when you go to work on a government project. People think they're really special because they know somebody who's on that team, and they'll send an email to your AOL account or to your Hotmail account, to tell you something or to offer some sort of suggestion. They often don't mean it maliciously, but when they do that, you need to forward that email from your AOL account or your Hotmail account or your Gmail account into your government account so that when you archive your records, you're keeping a seamless digital paper trail. Every government entity has a schedule for retention of records. It's created by administrative rules that the Department of State promulgates, and if you ever have a question about how long you're supposed to keep a record, the people to contact is the Florida Department of State, and it's the Division of Library and Information Services. They're the people who maintain the state archives, and they set the rules for how long, because you have to keep certain kinds of email for different periods of time than others, and they have a whole rubric about how you handle that. We are not the people you call with those questions. It's the Florida Department of State in Tallahassee. They are very, very helpful. They're very, very scholarly, and they will cut to the crux of your issue very quickly. One of the projects that the Attorney General's office does every year is produces a publication called the Government in the Sunshine Manual. There are technically two Sunshine Laws. There is the Public Records Law, which is Chapter 119 of the Florida statutes, which governs your records. And then you've got Chapter 286 of the Florida statutes, which governs your meetings. Those are meetings of government boards and commissions that are performing state business in some form or fashion. That means your city commissions, your county commissions, special commissions that a mayor or an elected official appoints that are delegated a specific government function. Just because an organization is a 501c3 nonprofit does not necessarily mean that they are subject to the Sunshine Law. There is such a thing as a private nonprofit, but when there's technically a multi-pronged litigation test for determining whether a 501c3 is subject to the Sunshine Law. But the short version of the story is, if you are a member of a board or commission that has been delegated some sort of government function, if you are on a board connected to a state university's hospital, chances are you are subject to the Sunshine Law. Chapter 286 is the law which establishes the standards for making government meetings of government boards and commissions, open and accessible to the public, should the public actually care enough to want to show up. Okay. Your homeowners association is not subject to the Sunshine Law. Okay. Your homeowners association is a separate private entity on separate private property. Your condo board is not subject to the Sunshine Law. But government boards and commissions that are making decisions about how to allocate government money for an urban planning project, or other government functions, are going to be subject to that meeting. Okay, an open government meeting has a handful of requirements, which sound a lot more difficult to meet than they actually are. Okay, the scope of the Sunshine Law is just to cover, meetings of government boards and commissions and meetings of public entities, and keeping the paperwork that, is produced in creation, the digital paperwork as well, that's created in connection with performing government business. Okay. The Sunshine Law requires that a meeting of a government board or commission be noticed. Okay. We're talking adequate public notice. Usually, your board or commission will have something built into either the statute that created it or the rules that govern it. You're going to need to provide at least 24 hours notice for a government meeting, and that's usually more of like an emergency meeting. A lot of your boards and commissions actually have a requirement by statute of notice in a publication called Florida Administrative Weekly. It's also called FAW, if you see that working into your governing documents. If you have to notice in Florida Admin Weekly, that means you really have to have the notice and the location taken care of and sent into Florida Admin Weekly. I believe it's 3 weeks in advance, so that it has time to get produced into the publication and released into general circulation. Sometimes you don't have to notice in Florida Admin Weekly. Sometimes you can just notice in a newspaper of general circulation for the area. And sometimes that's going to mean, 2 weeks plus to get a chance to buy the ad space and reserve it in the location. The second thing you're going to need is an accessible location. Okay, you cannot have a meeting of a government board or commission in a private club. We strongly advise against having meetings of your government boards and commissions in restaurants. We do this because we do not want average Joe six-pack citizen to feel in any way obligated to buy something when they enter a facility. And we also don't want you to have it someplace where it's going to be very crowded and there's going to be a lot of ingress and egress, because we want the meeting to be audible. We want the members of the public who show up at these things to be able to see you and to hear you. Libraries are almost always an excellent call. Sometimes if you're in a very small town, sometimes don't have a public library. There's usually some sort of community hall. Sometimes in a small town there is one church that has a parish hall that will let everybody in, and and if that's the most accessible location, that can sometimes be a perfectly good choice. You just want to make sure you're not having it someplace where people where there is any kind of discrimination on the basis of race or gender. You want to make sure that it's accessible. And you want to make sure that people do not, that there's no chilling effect on the thought that these people can show up and find the place accessible. You also need to make sure that minutes are taken at your public meetings. Okay, minutes must be taken. This does not mean that you need to hire a court reporter. It does mean that you have to have some sort of designated scribe there to take notes, so that you can, after the meeting is over, there's a reasonably quick turnaround, so that anyone who wants to just go on your website and read your minutes can do so and get an accurate reflection of what happened. On that same token, though, if you are having a meeting on a subject which you know will be controversial, it might mean moving from your typical location to a location that will allow for more people. If you know that you have 200 angry dog owners coming to be very, very angry about the new leash law, and you can see that coming, just make sure that you get adequate notice so that they know you're not meeting in the public library, you're meeting in the high school gym, and you want to make sure that you've got enough audio equipment so that everyone can see and be seen. And sometimes, if you know the discussion is going to be particularly heated, it might be worth the time and the investment to hire a court reporter. It may very well protect you in the context of a meeting to have a court reporter in the room. On the flip side, when you are having a public meeting, no matter how big or small your board is, no matter how micro-specialized the group is that you're working with, there's a good chance that you will have a pretty militant gadfly who will be obsessed with some teeny tiny micro issue within the jurisdiction of your board or commission. My advice on this subject is much more practical. Embrace that person. Make that person feel like he or she is your friend, and take whatever steps you can to diffuse the conspiracy theory. The more you push that person away, the more that person will be convinced that there is some nefarious plot against him, her, the mosquitoes, whatever it is that that person is obsessed with. And the more that you can do to make that person feel included, the better. There was a very brilliant group of women who run a small sheriff's office in a teeny tiny county in South Florida somewhere, who had a very, very feisty gadfly. And every time he strolls in the door, they greeted him with coffee and smiles and just, poured the sugar on him like nobody's business. And that man hates the county commission, hates the mayor's office, hates every other government entity in that teeny tiny county, but he loves him some sheriff's office. And he still goes in on a pretty regular basis wanting some emails and some records, but they know he's coming and they know how to handle him. And he does not hate the police, even though he hates everybody else. And they return, the sentiments. You really want to get your minutes up on your website as quickly as possible. And if you are on a government board or commission of any sort, even if you're like, seriously, I'm out of college for 5 years, I'm on this board, we talk about 3 subject matters, throw up a website anyway, and get your documents, your papers, your budgets, your minutes, get everything on that website, so that A, it will really dramatically reduce the hassle involved with staff, or for you, for that matter. But also, if there's quick turnaround, people can go pull the stuff off of your website, and they won't call and bother your records custodian. It's a really good idea to have one person as your designated records custodian. And that doesn't mean that that's the only person who has to respond to a public records request, but it's good to have a mother hen or father figure in charge of just making sure that everyone is handing over the records responsive to a request and getting it handled in a timely manner, making sure the right number of copies are there, and just handling it. And as much as you want to be able to handle as much of this as possible digitally, because you want to save paper. And a lot of times it's just easier to respond to a public records request with, okay, can I send this to you in email? Can I throw this in a zip file? Where would you like me to send this? All right, let's talk about the anatomy of a public records request. Anyone can request a public record. Anyone. Doesn't have to be a citizen, doesn't have to be someone within your county. You know, any random homeless, smelly, unattractive, undesirable person can wander in off the street and request public records. Everyone has the exact same right to access those records and documents as anybody else. Okay? They do not have to tell you who they are. Okay? They do not have to show you ID. And they do not have to tell you why they want the records they want. Okay? That is protected by law. Also, with your public meetings, keep in mind, you cannot have your public meeting in a building where people are asked for identification as a condition of entry. There was a school board down in, I think it was Miami-Dade County, and they would have their meetings inside of the school board building where everyone was required to show their driver's license to get in the door. You could not, you know, they needed to, you know, it's perfectly fine to make everybody go through a metal detector, because that's security. Okay, but you could not, you know, they asked us for an opinion. We cannot let you, you know, you cannot hold a meeting of a government board or commission where people are required to show identification as a condition of entry. Okay. There's a protection for anonymous speech. There's a protection for people who want to access these meetings. They don't have to prove who they are, which I know can be a real nightmare. I know from where I grew up, there was a church that wanted to do a massive expansion, and there was discussion about whether it was going to constitute a DRI. And the members of this church were showing up to all of the city council meetings and all the planning board meetings. Well, most of the people who attended this church were not residents of the city. And a lot of the residents of the city were very upset that these people who didn't live there and didn't have to park their cars there and didn't live in the neighborhood next door to that church, you know, who weren't going to be affected by the traffic, were getting to come in and speak about it. But that's a guaranteed constitutional right in Florida. It is the cost of doing business. So any person can come in and ask for the records. Every person who, you know, makes or receives records in connection with state business is a custodian of public records. You are responsible for making sure that you are keeping your email properly. You are responsible for managing your own documents as a member of a public board or commission or as a public employee. And your work that you do, you know, you do have archiving responsibilities. And you will have to keep things accessible. I would urge, for the sake of your sanity and for the sake of making your IT people not hate you, to organize these things into folders or to put them, you know, to name files in such a way that they will be easily retrievable. Because if you get a public records request, you want to be, the quicker and easier and cheaper that you can hand these things over to the requester, the better it is for everyone. For the most part, when people do a public records request, they tend to know what they want. They'll want everything related to the XYZ project. They'll want to know everything about, you know, related to a certain, you know, a certain beach, a certain location, a certain project. You know, and sometimes that will still generate a significant number of files. Just because, you know, if it's the biggest thing that's ever happened in your town, there could easily be 6,000 emails on that subject matter over the 6 months that that planning project is coming about. But if you can keep your stuff organized, it'll just help. There's nothing better than being able to just go on your desktop and click on a folder and stick it in an email and be like, peace out. I have done everything I'm required to do. And it will save your sanity. Let's see. Let's talk about, I don't want to click around too much on this website because I know there's a little bit of digital delay, and I also don't want to talk to you guys like a bunch of 4-year-olds because I know you're not stupid and you know how to surf the internets. There's a big misconception. An agency-imposed restriction on access to public records is a major league no-no. You are not allowed to impose a 48-hour automatic delay on guaranteeing public records. Okay, if it's there, the statute does not set a specific number of days or hours or minutes for retrieving public records. There is no magic number. The statutory standard is reasonableness. Okay. And people will call and ask what reasonableness means. And it means as soon as possible, which I know a lot of the more linear thinkers in the room are saying, thanks for nothing, that does me no good. What it really means is how quickly can you retrieve those records, pull them together, and make them accessible.
We have one question.
Sure.
We recently received a records request for all of our bus surveillance videos. What does the law say about this, and what are we required to provide?
You're keeping these videos. The first thing you've got to do is check the retention schedule with the Department of State on those records. You're keeping them for security purposes. The law says that those videos are public records subject to inspection and copying unless there is a statutory exemption specifically removing those videos from public disclosure. So every time you get a public records request, you should be operating under the assumption that it is a public record, and then checking with your supervisor, your legal counsel, to see if there is there are over 1,000 exemptions to the public records law in Florida, but they are all narrowly tailored for a very specific purpose. There are exemptions relating to methodologies of security, but often, the videos themselves, a DUI video from a traffic stop is a public record. Surveillance tape outside of buildings and locations for government entities are subject to disclosure. The recording of a 911 call is a public record. The identity of the caller reporting the 911 call is protected, but the call itself, the recording, is to be released. And these things are to be handed over quickly, and especially when something big is happening. If you have, you just need to sort of work these things into your culture as a government entity. If there is a shooting on your bus, the news stations are going to come and want every document, every video, anything that is being generated, in response to that incident. If God forbid something unspeakable happens, on a construction site or at a certain, meeting of your board or commission, you can very reasonably foresee that people are going to want to have all the juice related to that incident. The police in Lake Mary were smart. As soon as, that golf club hit Tiger Woods' head, they knew that the public was going to want to know everything about that incident report and everything that was not exempt related to that particular evening. And the Lake Mary police were really smart about handing it over. Every time the words Casey and Anthony appear in a sentence together anywhere, the state attorney's office in Orlando is going to get bombarded with public records requests. So they immediately scoot everything over to a Kinko's, because actually Kinko's is able to produce the copies cheaper and quicker than the state attorney's office is, and it's cheaper for the consuming public to buy those records.
Great, thank you. And one more question.
Sure.
Can recordings substitute for minutes? And if recordings are made, how do they need to be made available?
As cheaply as possible is the short version of the story. Could a recording, if you take a recording, that could substitute for minutes. And actually, while we're talking about recordings, I just want to, because I don't want to forget, if your citizens show up to a meeting and have an unobtrusive recording device of their own, they are allowed to record. Unobtrusive recording by the public is permitted. That's, it's permitted by law, while normally Florida is a two-party consent state with recording devices, and I can get into that later if you guys want to. In the course of a public meeting, you have a reasonable expectation of being watched, listened to, and citizens are allowed to unobtrusively record you. If you're going to keep a recording instead of minutes, that's fine. I would recommend that you, if possible, and I don't know, maybe IT will hate me for this, maybe convert it into an MP3 file or some kind of sound file and put that on your website and let them listen to it. Or, YouTube accounts are free. We learned that this past year. They can keep up to 10 minutes of video at a time. I believe Vimeo, a lot of people like Vimeo too. I would absolutely recommend putting as much of the stuff on your website as possible so people can listen to it and access it as quickly and cheaply as possible. Because sometimes converting on analog tapes can be a real pain in the butt, and it actually takes longer. So the more that you can do digitally, the better. And the more you can stash on your website, the better. I understand that we're all facing a resources crunch. We're all facing a staffing crunch. But, the gospel I'm really here to preach is to take the technology you've got and make the best of it and make the most of your agency or your group available online so that your staff can, each of one of your staffers can do 5 jobs instead of 6. A lot of people have questions about email. Your email to the person in the cube next to you about where you want to go to lunch, not a public record. You're not talking about business. You're talking about chicken. Okay. But your emails discussing policy decisions or how you're going to handle something is a public record. So, even though you're dreading that lady who is going to wear that ugly hat and show up at your meeting and yell at you, be mindful of how much trash you talk about her in that email, because that email will be public record. Or maybe you just don't care. But just know that it is subject to disclosure and copying. You can impose a mandatory holdover period before you hand things over. Sometimes you're going to have documents in your possession that will be of a delicate nature for whatever reason. When you're archiving, you might want to flag them. I know everyone has different email programs. Some of you are on Outlook, some of you are on Lotus Notes, some of you are on any number of other things. You really want to label things or flag them or tag them in some way so that, if you receive a document from someone that contains HIPAA information or something that contains definitely, I would think specifically HIPAA information. You want to flag it so that you'll have to redact certain information from it. But organization on the front end will save you a lot of hassle on the back end. Sometimes you will get a massive public records request. You will have a gadfly who will want every email containing the word "the" or something insane like that. Relating, not literally that, but some voluminous type of request, and there will be a reason for certain records to be reviewed and possibly redacted for confidential or exempt information. You need to. This is, sort of back to the whole keeping your records organized. You can't ever turn a public records request into a profit-making venture. I understand everybody's budget's been cut, but this is not the way you fill in your budget holes. All you are ever allowed to do with a public records request is to be made whole again for what you lose. The typical threshold for when you can start charging for the time to do redaction or review is 15 minutes. You should set your clock and start charging. And you're allowed to set it later. I almost never set the clock until after an hour because, if I can get it done without it completely eating up my whole day, I'd just as soon be done with it, throw it in the fax machine, toss it in an email, whatever, and get it over with. Also, if you're doing paper copies, you are not allowed to charge sales tax.
This is a follow-up question to that, although I think you've already addressed it. It just deals with video and the fact that transferring video files is extremely time-consuming. Mm-hmm. And are they allowed to set a realistic fee for the charge of that
yes.
for the requester?
Yes. It has to be the lowest paid employee possible who can do the job. Hey, you can't stick your $500 an hour attorney on that job. Although, if any of you have a $500 an hour attorney job, I would like to apply for it. But no, you need to get the lowest paid possible person who's capable of doing it. And you are only allowed to be made whole again for that. I understand it can be very time consuming, but a lot of times you can turn on the machine and walk away. You still shouldn't be charging your hourly rate. If you're able to walk away, you really are, you're only allowed to be charging for the extensive supervisory time that it's taking to do something. It's more like, and this tends to apply more to a law enforcement agency that's going over a giant criminal investigative file that has to make sure that they're taking out all of the names of the rape victims or the juvenile witnesses of a domestic assault, things like that. When you're copying and transferring files, it needs to be the actual cost of duplication.
Follow up to the and complete the work that open up their personal.
No, it's the documents and files that have to do with the work that are public record. Okay, it does not otherwise open up your Hotmail account. No one cares what you're doing on Farmville. It's always the letters and documents and substance that is your work. And if that is staying on your thumb drive and going back, keeping all of the appropriate, metadata and everything that goes with it, you're totally kosher. Okay, cool. You just can't, there is no, while we all embrace creativity and artistic thought, from a legal perspective, we are not asking, we would ask that you not come up with any new and creative ways of hampering access to public records or coming up with any new rules that would otherwise unreasonably inhibit access to records or meetings. You want to get this stuff to them as quickly and cheaply as possible, and as soon as you do that, you're able to get back to your real job, and your regular projects.
And do Facebook and Twitter also follow along those lines?
Yes, Facebook and Twitter has come up a lot more. For starters, you're more than welcome to Facebook and tweet your face off. I think, these social networking is a wonderful way to get into access with your constituents. But you should be using Facebook and Twitter to put more information out there, not as an excuse to withhold more of it from them. If you're using, I don't care if you spend 18 hours a day on Facebook in connection with your government work, but I better not hear about you slacking off on a garden variety public records request. And you need to apply the same retention schedule to your Facebook and to your Twitter that you would to your regular workplace computer. Facebook is fantastic for government work in a lot of ways. The Attorney General encourages it. I strongly encourage it. I think one of the best projects that we've come up with using social media for government is Amber Alert. Now people can get push messages on their iPhones telling them about a missing child. And it has, in the last year, there are just several instances where we're finding that kid dropped off unscathed in a Walmart parking lot in some county rather than dead in Alabama 4 days later. It is absolutely saving lives. And, since you guys are doing more transportation type stuff, you can be sending out push messages saying things like, XYZ road is clogged, the detour is here, estimated wait time is this. Absolutely throw that stuff out there. It's great. When you're working in areas where, you can predict that there are going to be problems on such and such street, put it out there. Do it. It's great. Especially with these things like Facebook and Twitter that can send push messages to people's phones. Do it. Have someone who's savvy enough to stay on top of it, but, get your message out there. More information is better. Twitter seems to keep things almost indefinitely on its own. Facebook, whenever I'm around government communicator meetings, my IT people tend to have disagreements. Some people like it when you screen grab every day to maintain the authenticity of the record. Some hate it and have some other software ideas that they want. I don't care how you do it. Just, you need to protect the integrity of the record. You need to not edit it. Some people get concerned about on Facebook having a wall and people writing inappropriate things. You can disable the wall function. You can use, you can, instead of creating a regular Facebook page, you could create a fan site and just, use that as a way of putting messages out there and not having to worry about people posting naked pictures or curse words or other things, offensive material on your page. You can turn it into a one-way communication vessel, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Someone has a communications call. I will get rid of that off the screen. Sometimes people just want to come in and inspect your public records, and then they'll decide. It's kind of a generation gap thing. The latest round of demographic research, and I apologize to anyone who's more on top of demographic research than I am, but the stuff that came out, I guess, in January, you got to understand your audience. 60% of African Americans do not have regular access to the internet. 40% of Hispanics do not have regular access to the internet. And something like 40+% of baby boomers are not accessing the internet all day, every day. And that sometimes sounds foreign to us because we all are so connected to our electronic devices. But there is a large percentage of regular folks out there who are not crack burying themselves into carpal tunnel syndrome. And, and that's cool. We still are going to have people who are going to want to review records and pick and choose which ones to hit print for. My one recommendation for that, particularly if you find you've got yourself a gadfly, if you've got a computer that doesn't really have much utility sitting around, maybe you want to have that in your front office as the reviewing station for public records. If it's sitting around and you can't really do anything with it, you don't have to put any internet on it necessarily. You don't have to put any kind of fancy software on it. I would just stick it in a corner in the front office, and if someone wants to review something, you can toss those files in there and let them pick page by page, and then they can just hit Control-P whenever they want to, and you can just stand there and tally up the bill. Okay, the bill for public records is 15 cents per page. And that's an 8.5 by 11 standard size REMA printer paper. Or if you're actually running it through your copy machine, you can charge 25 cents for a double-sided copy. A lot of people really aren't doing that anymore because they're just hitting print from their own email accounts. But 15 cents per page is going to be your industry standard. Now, when you get someone, there are going to be people who just want to see Commissioner X's email from last week. And you could just get IT to yank those puppies off of the server, toss them on a thumb drive, stick them in that, designated machine, and you can let that person go to town. And if you put them, in like the front corner of your front office, they can sit there, and your clerk or your person at your front desk can kind of be watching them but not really have to worry about them, do their own work and their own job all day, and the person can sit there maybe an hour, maybe two. Who cares? They can show up at 9 and you can throw them out at 5, but they won't bother someone, and they can sit there and they can just hit Control-P when they want to, and when they're ready to go, you can fill out the little invoice, give them the receipt, and collect the revenue. It's an easy thing to do, especially when you've got just some surplus machines sitting around not doing anybody any good. Might be a good way to handle, your biggest fan. Do not ever, ever ask a public records requester why they want a record. Sometimes you'll get someone who wants some massive quantity of information, and what I'll say is, I've checked with IT. We're happy to accommodate your request. Your request, the way you phrased it, produced 15,000 documents. We will have to review those documents to figure out which ones are responsive to the request. The paralegal is paid $10 an hour. She can work 8 hours a day. It'll take X number of days to complete that. We'll take a deposit for X number of $1,000. However, if you are interested in narrowing your request to a more specific data set, we'll be happy to do that, come up with a new estimate, and accommodate your request that way. 99 times out of 100, the requester will say, actually, I really only want to know what Commissioner X had to say about the Swift boat project on Tuesday, March 2nd. And that turns it into 500 emails, really quick and easy. Pull it up, and you say, all right, you want it in a zip file? I can email it to you, or I can print it out, and it's, one ream of copy paper, and it's, $28 or whatever. And it solves the problem. When you're dealing with the public, you want to always start with yes and. If you start with the word no, you're just itching for a fight, and someone will scream and yell and curse at you, and it'll totally wreck your day, and emotional eating is just not good for you. You are responsible for your records. You can't send someone, just because you're not in physical possession of them yourself. If someone emails you directly and says, I want these records from Commissioner such and such, you can't just say, pound sand, I don't have those. If they're in your agency, you can forward it, and this is why it's good to have this designated records custodian. You can send it, in our office, I send it to Sheila. This is Sheila, we got a public records request for, economic crimes files. And then Sheila will contact the economic crimes people and pull the records. Also, if you guys hold a record, but somebody else holds it too, and you just don't feel like dealing with that person, USF can't say, UCF has those records too, go call them. If someone makes the request of USF, then you have them, you pull them, even if it's really lame and annoying. You can't turn someone away for making a ridiculously broad public request, but you can offer them the alternative after you run the official, you want to make them feel like, you want to make the requester feel like you're not blowing them off. And particularly in this day and age, people are very quick to feel like they're being ignored and discounted. So run the search, even if you know that was a 10,000 email response. Give them a number and let them know, and let them feel like they're in charge and that you are working with them. You'll often get this whole, I pay your salary. Oh, really? Then let's talk about my dental plan. But you can't say that. You can think it with all of your might, but you can't say it. You may not require a public records requester to make their records request in writing. You can sit there and commit it to writing yourself. And if they walk into you off the street, you can say, okay, it's my understanding that you want the records related to the emails on December 2nd related to this. Is this an accurate reflection of what you want? And they can say yes or no, but you can't make them write it down. And you can't ask them why they want it, even if they want it for nefarious reasons.
Alexis, we had a question again about video and the requests for video that may show minor children. Are they required as the transit system to block out the images of the protected minor identities or any kind of accident involving a minor child?
Yep, that's a good question. I'm glad you've asked it. There are a lot of misconceptions about records of minors. Just because there was a minor in the room does not mean you have to blur out the kid's face. There are specific times, on a school bus videos are technically FERPA records. They're Federal Education Records Protection Act. They're records related to a student. And there's a separate set of privacy laws relating to student records. But just because there's a minor in the room, there are many times in criminal reports where a minor's name and identity are not exempt just because they're a minor. A minor's name and identity is exempt when that minor is a witness to a sex crime, when that minor is a witness to a certain kinds of domestic violence. But just because there's a kid there doesn't mean you have to blur out the kid's face. There has to be a very specific exemption applying to that kid. And you just have to work with the exemptions that are there. You cannot, you've also got to be really careful. As much as we're all concerned about privacy rights, you can't imagine privacy rights that aren't there. You can only go with the law that's written on the day of. You might know that your legislator is out there lobbying, and writing a new bill that will make something illegal by July 1st, but you have to work with the law that you have. So just because there's a minor, technically, a minor's driving record, a 13-year-old kid who steals a car, the record of that incident is public record, and everyone can know the name of that young kid who stole that car. There was a minor child, I guess a year or two ago, who commandeered a Lynx bus in Orlando. And everyone, when the incident report came out on that, everyone was able to know the kid's name. It turns out the kid had just always wanted to be a bus driver. And when the bus driver stepped off the bus to use the restroom or something, the kid jumped on and did the rest of the route. And most of the bus riders had no idea that it was a minor child driving the bus. But the kid did a great job. It ended up being sort of a teachable moment, too, because the child was then given some mentors, and people were working with him, and eventually, who knows, the kid might grow up and be a Lynx bus driver in however many years. But, all's well that ends well.
And then another question, kind of going back to one of the topics that you brought up initially, is it okay to ask but not require FOIA requests to give ID and purpose?
No, do not. What I'll do is I'll say, be happy to get those records for you. How would you like me to send them to you? Would you like me to mail them to a specific address? Would you like me to email them to a specific account? How would you like this to be? I can, these files are all available digitally. How would you like them sent to you? If I have to print them, it'll be 15 cents per page plus postage. But if I email them, and sometimes they will create some dummy account on Hotmail, and that's okay. And it is not our business to know. For all I know, someone could request all of my email and wallpaper their garage with it. I don't care. It's none of my business. It's that loser's business. Enjoy. My emails aren't that interesting. But, they're allowed, and we do not have a right as government to know what they want to do with it. Sometimes they'll volunteer it anyway. But, sometimes it's just some weirdo who wants a bunch of stuff because they want it.
And following along those lines, what are the requirements for providing a copy of video surveillance to a transit passenger that's ultimately going to use it as a lawsuit?
It's going to come out in discovery anyway. Okay. You can't run and you can't hide in this particular situation. And that's the thing about public records. I know it's going to sound kind of hokey, but it really is true that the public records laws will often protect you more than they will hurt you. That same video that will be authenticated and used, the person might use it in a lawsuit, but it also might show that person was rip-roaring drunk and peeing out the window when the crash took place. So you just never know. And you always want to err on the side of disclosure and transparency rather than looking like you're trying to hide something. Because actually, screwing around with the public records law could lead to far greater damages later on down the road in the event that there is a real full-blown lawsuit.
Great, thank you. And if there are any other questions, you're more than welcome, everyone, to use your Q&A drop-down manager to type in your question. We will be concluding fairly shortly, and I will make this website available to all of you on your computer so you can click through it and review some of the things that Alexis has talked about, as well as some additional things. One more question was if a board serves in an advisory capacity only, do notice and minutes rules apply?
Yes. Actually, the big difference between committees that are subject to the Sunshine Law and committees that are not subject to the Sunshine Law is the advisory capacity. Sometimes a government entity will delegate a purely fact-finding function to a group of people, and that will not be subject to the Sunshine Law often, because if all they're doing is, crunching numbers or looking for data, that might not be subject to the Sunshine Law. But when they're making a policy when they're advising something, even if their vote isn't binding. The law has created this provision so that any citizen could go watch that and oversee that. For example, an advisory committee for a university gets a list of 7 applicants for the dean of the business school. The committee that reviews, all 8 applicants and then pares that list down to 4, that is subject to the Sunshine Law, so that anyone who actually cared enough to go to that thing should be able to go.
Great.
Okay.
That looks like it's it for the questions. If anybody else has any last questions, please type them now as Alexis concludes the presentation.
One thing that comes up fairly often, you do not have to respond to a standing public records request. This sometimes ticks off reporters, but you are only required to produce records which you possess right now. Someone cannot show up and say, I want all of Alex Bond's email for the next 6 months, and I want it every Thursday. If he wants it every Thursday, he can renew his public records request by email or by phone or whatever on that day. You are required to produce the records in your possession. You are not required to have all this stuff on autopilot in the future. You can only produce what you've got. The Public Records Act also doesn't require you to produce some employee to go stand in the hallway and answer questions about that public record. I mean, you've got a media office, you've got a public information officer of some sort, but you do not have to have a magical jukebox to answer every question about a record. You just have to produce the records themselves.
And what part of the government's personnel records are subject to the Sunshine Law, if any?
The vast majority of them are. Your personnel records for a government employee are going to be public record. There are certain classes of people whose addresses will be exempt from the public disclosure. People like code enforcement officers, police officers, firefighters, former police officers, firefighters, prosecutors, HR people in certain capacities, juvenile justice officers, guardians ad litem, code enforcement. There's a whole long list in the Public Records Act, and sometimes there are exemptions worked into statutes governing specific types of boards or commissions that are worked in it where exemptions will apply. But those will be things like your address, your phone number, your kid's school, your spouse's workplace. But your discipline record is fair game.
And Social Security numbers?
Social Security numbers across the board are exempt. The legislature has made a finding that Social Security numbers, were created as a tax ID number. They were created for a very specific purpose. They have morphed and been used into a bunch of different things, but your Social Security number should not be disclosed, period. And, all of your HIPAA information, HIPAA is going to supersede the Public Records Law.
And then there was a question on the information that you were talking about before about having it be archived with regard to public records requests.
Mm-hmm. You're going to archive your email internally through whatever your software module is, and then your records, once they're archived, are subject to destruction, so to speak. The schedule for archiving is, you can actually download it off of the Department of State website. You can go to the Florida Department of State and look for the Division of Library and Information Services. And that is they have a packet, they have downloadable files, whether you're law enforcement or whatever. For those of you out there who work for private entities that have a contractual relationship with a government entity, the records and documents created within the scope of that contractual relationship are public record. Not all of your documents as an entire entity are subject to the Public Records Law. It's just your relationship for the delegated function that you are performing for government that are subject to disclosure. But that does mean that sometimes a private entity will be subject to a public records request, and you will be required to produce records related to that relationship. they're not allowed to have, the requester can't, doesn't have the right to go dumpster diving through your entire company. But the records related to when you have been delegated a government purpose or you are in a contractual relationship with a government entity for a specific jurisdiction, those records are subject to disclosure.
So just to clarify, if the records are archived, you don't have to worry about providing it or digging it up?
If the records are archived, and they're still within the time frame that you're required to keep them, that's when you send IT to go dig them up out of the archives. But as long as, they're in your possession and you're keeping them properly, you're fine. But you are going to have to archive your email every so often just because, I have to do it like once or twice a week because after about 75 kilobytes, my computer starts getting angry at me. But, you can send IT to go pull those things up out of your email archive. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. All of these basics were on myflsunshine.com in our frequently asked questions section. We have the entire Sunshine Manual, which can get into very specific exemptions, as the third tab over. It's 180-something pages. The only thing that's not included in that manual that would be included in the paper copy would be the case law index. So your in-house counsel might want to drop the $25 on the book. But for a day-to-day practitioner who doesn't need to memorize case law, you can download that whole book for free right there off of our website. The next tab over is the Sunshine Law itself, so you can read the text of the statutes if you really want to. And we have some additional resources from the law itself to the First Amendment Foundation, which we work with often, the Breckner Center for Freedom of Information, which is at the University of Florida. We did a lot of research in the last year on sunshine laws and technology. You can read the minutes from our meetings where we were discussing the implications of the public records law on technology. Our October meeting had a presentation from BlackBerry. Actually, Research in Motion vice presidents came down and made a presentation for us. If that interests you, have at it. The November meeting, we had a representative from Microsoft who had also been a CIO for Washington State come talk to us about, website management and, using online technology for getting in touch with your citizens. And the February 22nd meeting was talking about Facebook and Twitter and social networking. You can look through our AG opinions. Your staffers and clerks who are dealing with the stuff on a day-to-day basis, those Sunshine training videos on the left-hand side of the screen. We have one specifically for law enforcement. We have one specifically, we called it local government, but just about any government entity could do it. And in the citizens tab, we made YouTube videos that cover basic concepts like fees and redactions and how the laws work. It's 10 minutes of me talking on those videos. You do not have to watch me talk because underneath all of those videos there is a transcript, so you can just read it and not stare at my face all day long, because God knows I get sick of listening to myself. But all those things are available. My office phone number is on there, my address. You can contact us. You can get, there's lots of resources on there that you can enjoy or ignore at will. And, more than anything, I just want you guys to realize that, we don't want you to get sued. I'm very proud of the litigation that the Attorney General does on behalf of citizens, and for state agencies, but I'm also very, very proud of all the litigation that we've been able to avoid. When in doubt, call us. We're here to help you, and we don't want you to get sued. And, and please, particularly in this day and age, be very mindful, even though you hate some of these people who come in and are rude and nasty to you wanting public records. Some of those gadflies have made a lot of money, and a handful of law firms in Florida have made a lot of money in the last couple of years suing state and county, particularly county school boards and local government entities for public records violations. If you find out that someone's been messing around and you're coming up on day 30 of a delinquent public records request, day 30 is kind of a magical day for angry public records requesters. They can file suit, they can recover their attorney's fees when they win, and you can go back to your constituents and explain that. They will not be happy. Florida State University was named in a lawsuit alongside the NCAA last year for a public records violation. They are paying $70,000 in attorney's fees to law firms hired by the newspapers. And, while Florida State is firing professors, they got to pay $70,000 in legal fees. That did not make their people happy. The NCAA had to pay more, but that's not much of a comfort. So avoid. You can save yourself a lot of hassle and a lot of embarrassment and a lot of flaming pitchfork-bearing citizens by just handling this stuff on the front end. And give us a call if you need us. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to call me if you need anything. And have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you again for your time this afternoon. Thank you, Alexa, for your presentation.